Good day, friends. Welcome to Our Power is Within podcast. I'm your host, Chasmith, and my mission for this podcast is to inspire you to take your power back and to realize that you are the healer that you've been looking for all along. It is possible for us to heal in mind, body, and soul. So, let's start this week out with a challenge. And let's go back to one of our classic neuroplasticity challenges. It's an oldie but a goodie. Every time you leave your house, whether it is in your car to go to work or drive to your grocery store or even on foot taking your dog for a walk, could you take a different route or path? Try a change of scenery and get yourself out of autopilot. Because going a different way than you are used to requires you to focus more on the process and make decisions that normally you might not consciously make when you take the same habitual route day in and day out. So this week, change it up, have fun, find something in your surroundings new to notice, and just play around with it. See how many new routes or paths could you take this week. Our guest today is Andi Locke Mears. Andi has joined me in a wonderful and informative discussion today, helping us to understand some of the more common mental disorders through the lens of GNM, GHK, German New Medicine, Germanic healing knowledge. Andi is dedicated to helping others awaken to the truth about their health. She spent her entire career educating people about holistic healing methods, and she has been a GNM GHK teacher and consultant since 2009 and has spent the last 3 years on a GNM GHK International Team. She has been instrumental at expanding the gifts that Dr. Hammer discovered into the English-speaking international community. She collaborates with colleagues around the world, including overseeing the editing of Dr. Hammer's original workshops into English. And today, what we dive into is just barely scratching the surface on what is possible for us to understand about our mind, body, psyche, brain, and the biology of our beingness and more. So let's go ahead and welcome Andi to the show. Andi, thank you so much for being here today with me. I am so excited to get to dive into all the fun, juicy topics we're going to be talking about today.
It is my pleasure. I am so glad to be here as well.
Yay! So what I like to do is usually have my guests start out by sharing a little bit about themselves. Maybe you could share about how you got into the knowledge of German New Medicine and Germanic healing knowledge for our listeners. And then from there, we could maybe just do a little brief background on what GNM and GHK is in case anyone is new to the podcast or just not familiar with what this is that we'll be talking about today.
Absolutely. Yes. That's important to do because otherwise this is like, speaking Greek in an English world. So so a little bit about myself. I'm a traditional naturopath. I've been interested in health and nutrition and holistic things since the mid 70s. So I've been immersed in this world for a long time. And then around 2001 started to do a lot more professionally with it, getting lots of trainings in the traditional naturopath and certification and things like that. In 2006, I opened up a wellness center in Maine, which is where I was living at the time. And that turned out to be very successful from day one, much to my amazement. And that was great. And then in around 2007, 2008, I started hearing about this thing called German New Medicine. And I'd never heard of that. And I'd been in this field for, over 20 years at this point. So I'm like, what the heck is that? So I was so busy with my wellness center. I didn't feel like I could go and get trained in anything. So I just bought the book, thinking, well, I'll just read the book. If I think it's good, I'll just, share the information with people. Well, I got the book, and while it's in English, it made absolutely no sense. And it was like this mystery. So I shelved it for a while. For a year, I would take it out every few months, thinking, okay, I'm smart. I've got a master's degree. I can figure this out. And I couldn't. So I'm like, okay, intuitively, I was hearing that I absolutely needed to learn this. I made time in my schedule, went up to Canada, which was not a far piece for me since I was right there in Maine. And I got trained. And in the first 30 minutes of the first conference, the first day of the workshop, I totally understood how to read the book. So it was like this key in the lock, and this unlocked a whole new world to me that to say it changed my life is a super understatement. It changed everything about everything for me. I got home on a Monday night. On Tuesday morning, barely understanding this, I pulled it out and started working with it with my first client. And that's how I learned, was working with people. I got a lot more additional training, went around the world several times to different conferences, advanced conferences and things, and started to really hone in on this. In 2012, I sold my wellness center, moved down to the North Carolina area, and took my business online. I was on an international team for 3 years. When I got off of that, I decided my passion really truly is to teach. I'd been doing consultations virtually since 2012, which was great. So that when 2020 hit, I had been doing this for many years, and that was nothing new for me. So, but I started teaching, developed my online courses that have now expanded. And now I'm teaching many online courses for all people, all walks of life, all health diagnoses, you name it, we've got something for you. So that's a little bit about me. Does that suffice? Does that give you enough flavor of who I am, do you think, Chad Smith?
Yes, yes. And you said it changed everything about everything, and it like really, so it really just clicked for you. Like it just really made sense for you with your
You know, it
background. And
it did, right, because I'd already been working with people for a number of years, and I'm a fairly intuitive person. I meditate, all of this stuff, in touch with my higher self, my body, the cells in my body, all of that. And yet there's still gaps in the knowledge. And I'd had a lot of holistic training. I was trained in herbal medicine, homeopathy, all kinds of nutrition, essential oils, energy work, all of this. I had done all of this with people for years, and there were still gaps in my knowledge. There were still gaps in my life, I would say, for myself. So once I learned Germanische Heilkunde, which is what we call it now, it's like, oh, all the gaps were filled in, all of them. And that was amazing. And it didn't happen all at once. It took years to fill in these gaps. And I'm still filling in the gaps, but the gaps are so much more filled in now than they ever have been.
and your experience too, having 8+ years now working with clients through this body of knowledge, does it just always make sense? Like the more you work with people, does it always make sense what's going on with them in their body?
Absolutely. And know that I've started working with this clinically in 2009. So I've been doing this for 13 years, working with people, consulting with people. And it was my clients who verified this for me. I would see their symptom. They'd come into my center. We would do a session. I would see their symptoms. I would determine what they were from a GNM, GHK perspective. And that's what made me understand that this is absolutely true. Because the things they told me, and then when I looked up about their symptoms, no one could make this stuff up. It was absolutely accurate 100% of the time. That's what made me believe in this, because I had proof in every client who came in day after day, day after day. I had proof that this was accurate information 100% of the time, not 95%, 100%.
Right. And you definitely probably at this point, you probably didn't get 100% like accuracy when you were just using homeopathy or herbs and things like that. Though they all are beneficial and they can absolutely support healing phases, it probably didn't answer all the questions 100% of the time.
Absolutely. So, in other words, trying one homeopathic remedy or herbal formula or diet for one person and they had good results, and then for somebody else, very similar with similar symptoms, and it didn't work at all. It's like, oh my gosh, I think I'm going crazy here. It worked for this person. Why isn't it working for this person with the exact same symptom? So that's where the gaps come in, and anyone who works with people in the holistic field will tell you that there are gaps in every modality.
Yes. Yes. And as we know, German medicine, Germanic healing knowledge is not a modality. It's knowledge. It's an understanding of the language of the body. And then you can use and utilize various tools to help support the healing.
Exactly. And that's one of the most important things for people to understand. This is not something you do like a modality like acupuncture, herbs, nutrition. It's not that. It is a new definition and a new understanding of biology, physiology, pathology, psychiatry, psychology, and behavioral issues. All of it. In
Wow.
other words, the human experience.
Wow, I didn't know it was all those things, but then that kind of makes sense because, well, like for example, today we're going to be talking about mental disorders, and in the past on the podcast, I've had several other um, practitioners come on and talk about the GHKG GNM perspective of like a lot of chronic illness that shows up in the body, but this will be the first time that we actually talk about mental disorders, which is really fascinating.
Right, right, exactly. Well, let me give you a little thumbnail for the folks who are like, what the heck are they talking about? And what we're talking about is the work and the discoveries of one physician, Dr. Reiki Gerd Hammer. He lived in Germany and many, years ago. And in the late 70s, his son, well, he received a phone call that his teenage son had been accidentally shot while on vacation. So he and his wife were both physicians. They rushed to their son's side. Oh, this was in August of 78. In December, his son died in his arms. You can imagine how devastating this is for a father, a couple, and also for physicians who couldn't save their son. A short time after that, Dr. Hammer was diagnosed with testicular cancer. Now, this is a very strong, robust man. He was very tall, very robust. He'd never been sick. And suddenly he had this huge diagnosis. And he started thinking just intuitively, gosh, there's got to be a correlation. I just had this huge trauma, and now I have this diagnosis. There's got to be a relationship. So he had surgery, he got through that, and once he was fine again, he started researching. He thought the brain held a key. He needed to look at the brain in a way no one else had. So he took CT scans. That was the new toy of the time, and he was working at the University of Munich at the time, in working with cancer folks. He took CT scans of everyone, and he realized they all had a targeted ring formation in their brains in different areas. So he started talking to them. What's gone on in your life? He realized everyone who had been diagnosed with testicular cancer had experienced a profound loss. They had lost someone close to them. All of them, not just half of them, all of them. And of course, he had too. So he's starting to see this correlation, and he starts gathering this information, and he realized that people who had the circle in the same area in the brain had experienced the same sort of trauma or distress prior to their diagnosis, and they all had the same diagnosis. And again, there were no exceptions. It was 100% of the time. So he went on to then map out the entire brain. He discovered what the conflict shock is, what he called it, what the biological conflict shock was for every single dis-ease that we have. That was amazing information. Once he finished mapping out the brain and figuring all of that out, he turned his attention to what you and I would call mental health, because he had worked in the mental health field prior and he understood its limitations. And he said, I'm going to see if there's any truth to this in the mental health field. So he looked at CT scans of people with certain mental health diagnoses, and he realized that they run the same pattern that our biological programs do. So every disease is a biological program that is in you, that has started, that has adapted your tissues so to most optimize your chances of survival. Well, the same is true for what we'd call mental illness. It's just a little bit more complex than that for mental illness. Do you want me to continue with that at this point?
Yeah. This is so good. I'm so interested. I'm so excited to learn all about the mental health side of things.
Awesome. Okay. So what you have to understand is that for, let's go back to a physical ailment. Let's say someone has, what's a common one? Let's say an upset stomach. All right. And so what we know is that there is a conflict shock that occurs. There is something that's distressing in their life. So let's say we've got a 10-year-old child and they get yelled at in school and then picked on the recess, and they're really upset. Pretty soon they have a tummy ache, right? And so once they get home and they're away from it, let's say it's the weekend, it all resolves. Now they go into the healing phase. Well, at that moment that they had that bullying and teacher yelling at them, this particular boy, let's say, would have had cell loss in a very specific area in his body. And in this case, it's the mucosal lining of his stomach, it's the duodenal bulb or the pylorus. So it's a very specific part of his stomach. Then after it's resolved, let's say he's away from school, he's now home, he's relaxed, he's with his family, and he resolves it. And now there's going to be cell replenishment. He lost cells. So he had part of the body that was weaker. So now he's going to replenish those cells. And that's what we call being sick. This is the second phase of every dis-ease out there. Every disease has two phases: the conflict active phase, where we're upset. And then once that's resolved, we're fine and more emotionally, but now we have physical symptoms that help our body to return to homeostasis. So he would have had a stomach ache in his healing phase. And then once he's over with that, he's back to his day-night cycle. There's more to it than that, but without a visual, I'm just explaining it just very simply here. Let's turn to what we call mental illness. The conflict active phase occurs when you have a distressing event, you're caught on the wrong foot, you are not expecting it, and it's shocking. It's like, oh my gosh, what's going on? It's isolating. You're focused on it. You just lost your job. You just found your partner in bed with someone else. Those are big things. It can also be something really little. You're tired, you get home at the end of the day, your spouse is upset and kind of lays into, you see him or her, yelling at your kids, and that could be upsetting in a smaller way. All of those start programs. When we're conflict active, it means we're upset. We're mulling it over. We're thinking about it. Our hands and feet might be cold. Now imagine you're conflict active with one conflict, and then boom, you're impacted with a second conflict. That goes to a different area of the brain. It switches from one hemisphere now to the other. So what we call the hammer focus, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is the targeted ring formation, it's always going to be in a certain area in the brain. And then with that second distressing event, it will go to the opposite hemisphere. Depending on what the issue was that occurred, will depend on where it goes in the brain. So it turns on yet another program in the other hemisphere. And now the hemispheres of your brain are vibrating out of sync with each other. You're conflict active with a different conflict generally with each hemisphere. It could be the same conflict shock that occurred, but it impacts you in two different ways. So it still impacts you in both hemispheres. Again, your brain is your brain hemispheres are vibrating out of sync with each other. The absolute moment that that second conflict impacts in the other hemisphere in your brain, you are now what we call constellated. You've turned on both hemispheres, and now there's an immediate behavioral change. It's a behavior, mental illness, mood disorder. Something shifts instantly,
Mm.
depending on where those relays ended up in the brain, where those circles are in the brain, depends on what the flavor of how you behave. You might get angry all of a sudden. You might get really internal. You shut down and go inward. You might puff yourself up. It's like, well, I'm better than that. I'm the best at this, kind of boasting. You might suddenly have incredible insights and hear people talking that have passed over. You suddenly became very psychic. So there are about 25 to 30 different combinations for what we would call mental illness. How are we doing so far?
So good. Okay, so I want to ask a couple quick questions for clarity. So this is so interesting. So when you are talking about this being conflict active and then having another conflict while you're still in conflict activity, you mentioned this could be the same, like the same conflict, but could it also be different?
Yes. Yes,
Okay, so it could be
absolutely.
same or different. The whole
Correct.
the whole point is that if you're in an active conflict state and then you have a second conflict shock within that conflict state, now you're multi-conflict active essentially. So
Right. We call it being double conflict active. It's double sympathicotonic, is the official term.
now is it possible, I can only imagine it is based on even my own history, that you could have like multiple, like more than two conflict active states at once?
Ooh, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. And that gets us to the bigger picture of what Dr. Hammer discovered, especially when you understand constellations and now you look at different societies around the world. So, when you look at societies that are, I'm going to paint a picture of, let's say, a fairly tribal society. Okay, let's go to Africa. Let's go to the Andes in South America. Let's go to tribal indigenous people who have, certain communities that are set up and structured certain ways. They do not have the conflict shocks that our society, such as here in America and in Europe, that we have, because they have a very different social unit, and what impacts them is very different than what impacts us. In other words, what impacts us is a lot more than what impacts them. So now we have a society that is highly constellated
Mm.
because because of the issues of the past 100 years that have happened in, I'm going to say our country in America because that's where I live, although I see it in the quote developed world all around us. The developed world is the constellated world in my mind. So now we're running all kinds of programs, so many more than what our ancestors did even one or two generations ago. And we're seeing huge divisions right now. We're seeing wars, we're seeing bombings, we're seeing guns being used on children. We're seeing all kinds of things that just have never happened in society at this magnitude. And that's because we're seeing a constellated society. And because of that, we have our children growing up in that. And generally by age 5, they have multiple constellations.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have, well, is it now, okay. I know that sometimes you have say a trauma, big or small, but however you perceive it, you can actually have multiple conflicts develop at once from one situation. So is this going to have the same impact that we're talking about right now, as if you are just running a program and then another situation shocks you? Does that
Right,
make
right.
sense?
I think so. So, yes. So, if we're talking physical symptoms, you could have one really devastating incident that starts, 10, 15 programs in your body, which
Mhm.
will then become 10 to 15, diseases, if you will.
And also that constellates you?
And that may or may not, it all depends on the combination. This is a very
Oh,
set number of combinations.
okay. So 25 to 30 is that's what you're referring to when you said what's been discovered is there's 25 to 30 specific combinations that
Yes,
make up the various mental disorders.
correct.
Okay, so then is that combo for anxiety the powerless and frontal fear?
Yes, the frontal lobe constellation is an impact in the frontal lobe, which is like behind your forehead, and it involves the thyroid duct and the pharyngeal duct relays. Those are the circles in the brain. And it's involving frontal fear, which is fearing something ahead. So you're obsessed with, oh my gosh, is this going to happen? Am I going to be late for this meeting? Or is there going to be a nuclear bomb dropped tomorrow? It can be any multitude of things, and a feeling of powerless. There's nothing I can do. So it's stressful, right? It's stressful.
Mhm.
But that's what we would call anxiety. And how many people have that on the planet right now?
Right, that's what I was thinking cuz I hear a lot of like you always get like the like devil's advocate questions, which is fair, but you'll get like, "Oh, well, we have more issues today," we're saying, but why did people die so young from dis-ease in the past? And like when I hear you talking right now, I just keep thinking, yeah, but we have an all-time high record of mental disorder in our country. Like people just riddled with anxiety and um, OCD behaviors and all this other stuff. Like, and so that this all makes so much sense because our lives are so much more stressful and impacted and affected nowadays.
Right, exactly. We live in a very fast paced society. Right.
Hmm.
If you talk with your grandparents, people who grew up in the early 1900s or so, depending on how old you are, then it was a very different life. I mean, I grew up in the 60s. We I remember getting color TV. So, I remember, oh my gosh, the invention of the being able to record a TV show. We had 4 TV channels growing up. That is a very different world. That was not that long ago, very different from how our kids now are being raised. And I'm not saying one is bad or wrong. I'm just saying it's different and it impacts us differently.
Hmm.
We haven't quite caught up on a biological level to our world that we live in.
Right. Yeah, that makes so much sense. So, can we talk about some of the major main mental disorders that we see prominent in society, in our culture, in our country, and yeah, just have like a understanding of them through this lens and what the combination of conflict shocks can be, and through the knowledge of GHK, can we actually indeed through healing these conflicts, can we actually overcome these mental disorders?
Okay, those are great questions. Yeah, let's look at some of the more common ones. We talked about anxiety, that's incredibly common right now.
Hmm.
And what are some other ones? I would say depression is a big one as well. And
Hmm.
depression is actually not a constellation, but we categorize it in this because it is a mental change. It's actually a single conflict shock that impacts in a very specific area in the brain on the right hand side of the brain in the temporal lobe. So if anyone has a relay that's activated there, they will instantly be depressed. Now, when I use the word depressed, and any word that I use after this that you think, oh, I know what that is, you're thinking of the allopathic definition. I am not. So mine is a GHK definition, and while the terminology can be the same or similar, it's different definitions. So our definition of depression will be anywhere from, again, it's a continuum, anywhere from someone who's more withdrawn and inside themselves, so what we might call introvert, to someone who's really what we would say clinically depressed, who's they're really in a bad way. They can't get out of bed. They don't want to live, and there's a huge amount of space between those two elements. Someone who can go about their day, live a good life, and yet they're withdrawn. And they have the same program as someone who's just this side of being suicidal, hates their life, wants to leave.
Wow,
All right,
really?
so same program. It's all about the intensity of that conflict shock that determines where they
Interesting.
lie on that spectrum.
What is the conflict shock?
Well, there's 4 different conflict shocks, so it would all depend on which one's been activated. These are territorial issues, and it's going to be, I'll say it's actually 10 different conflict shocks. But as long as they impact on the right side, this gets into right-handed versus left-handed. A
Hmm.
left-hander will have this as a first conflict. For a right-hander female, it's a second conflict. This gets really convoluted, so I'm trying to keep this super easy. But they're territorial issues generally that are on the right-hand side, and those are a territorial fear, territorial loss, territorial anger, and a territorial marking conflict, which is a boundary issue.
Mm,
That's in a nutshell. There's more to it than that, but in a nutshell.
okay. And here's the thing. It's like for me, even I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, what's a normal fear versus a territorial fear? What's like a normal loss
Right.
versus a territorial loss,
That's a great question. And so the answer lies in it has to have 3 criteria to be considered a biological program versus an emotion. The
Hmm.
3 criteria I mentioned earlier: you're caught on the wrong foot, you weren't expecting it, you couldn't prevent it, and it's isolating. You're focused on it, you're experiencing it by yourself.
Interesting. Okay, this is totally a little off base, but not totally.
Mhm.
Um, how do we end up with self-devaluation conflicts? I can't correlate how most self-devaluation is being caught on the wrong foot. It kind of just feels like this low key, low grade, always feeling, like not good enough and not enough of some sort.
Right. Okay. So we're talking about the original conflict shock versus the tracks.
Hmm. Oh.
The original conflict shock would have fit those three criteria in order for that program to be switched on.
Oh.
After that, we can have many tracks, which is just a thought, a feeling, a person that we see, and it starts the program again.
I have never heard of this explained this way. Tracks can literally just be thoughts or feelings.
Oh, absolutely. It's usually what they are.
It doesn't always have to be something outside of us.
Correct.
So, if you heal the original conflict, do the tracks just disappear or do you still have to work on the tracks?
No, they'll disappear. Yep.
Hmm.
That's why we always want to try to find the original conflict shock.
Sure. But you can also, if you don't know what the original conflict shock is, you can work on shifting your perception and downgrading the conflict through adjusting, like through minimizing the tracks.
You can, but you can also resolve it not knowing the original conflict shock. I've done that myself.
Oh.
So, yeah, I mean, ideally we want to because that's the most complete thing.
Hmm.
But it is possible not to, and it is possible to look at your tracks and resolve all those, and the whole thing resolves.
Okay.
So
Wow.
I've seen it both ways. It all depends. It's not absolute. You can't say, okay, for you to resolve this, all you have to do is this. We can't do that. It's so individual.
Right. Right. Okay. So, this is a little off track from the mental disorders, but I think it's good. What is the difference between a territorial loss versus conflict versus which leads to depression or could lead to depression versus at the very beginning when you talked about a profound loss that led to testicular cancer? They're both losses. So what's the difference? Is it all in interpretation?
It's all that's a great question. Yes. So every person on this planet has their own interpretation. Their psyches will have
Hmm.
their own interpretation of the events. Your psyche is made up of all of who you are. It's how you were raised, the environment you're raised in, the culture you're raised in, your family, what your birth order is, what your, I'm going to say what your astrology sign is, what your past lives have been. That's my adding that in. But it's you as an individual. And there's 8 billion people on this planet, and we could all experience this, a similar event and have 8 billion interpretations of it and 8 billion different, there aren't 8 billion programs, but, you know, we could all have a different physical manifestation of a disease or a mental illness because of our individuality. It's all about how our psyche, our individual psyches, interpret the events. So here's an example of what your psyche does. So let's say you're driving along and you're going, you're on the highway, you're going 65 miles an hour or so. And right away in front of you, there's this huge accident. And so your first instinct isn't to, sit there and think about, what should I do here? You've got a half a second to slam on the brakes or swerve. Before you slam on the brakes or swerve, your psyche has already turned on a program. And now you're going to slam on the brakes and swerve. That's how fast this happens. Your psyche's already interpreted this event, figured out what it means for you, and it's turned on the program that you need in that moment to help you survive.
That is crazy.
Yeah, it is. It's totally crazy. But it's also awesome because this is how our bodies are taking care of us.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy, but it's amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
Yes.
I mean, the more I learn about this, the more I'm just completely blown away at how incredibly, like, genius our bodies and brains actually are.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Much more than we ever thought.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay. So, kind of getting back into this mental disorder topic here. So, we have anxiety, and we know that's from two different combinations, or a combination of two different conflicts. And we kind of went into that. And
Yep.
then you're talking about depression, which is not necessarily a constellation, but a mental change. And from a GHK perspective, this is the whole spectrum from low grade, low key, non-clinical depression all the way to like suicidal depression.
Right.
And then you have what are some of the other popular ones? Bipolar. What can you explain that one?
Bipolar. Sure. Yeah, and that will kind of fit into, you had just said suicidal depression. And
Hmm.
from our Germanische Heilkunde, if you're depressed, you cannot commit suicide. In order for a depressed person to commit suicide, they have to sit on a manic track. So, what this means, let's go back to brains. We've got two hemispheres, right and left hemispheres. We know depression's on the right side, in just the temporal lobe. That's the right side. On the left side, in the temporal lobe, is what we call mania. And now think of someone who's manic. They're crazy, right? They're like going a mile a minute. That's our interpretation. Again, it's very different from a GHK perspective. It can be somebody who's upbeat, who's goal driven, a type A personality. They're manic. They're setting on a manic track, which means they're starting that conflict over and over and over again, and this is their life. So, in order for a depressed person to have the energy to get that rope and go up to that tower and hang themselves, they have to switch to the manic side because that gives them the energy to now actually kill themselves. Which is why medications, you see suicides after people are on medications. It takes them out of depression, puts them into mania. Now they have the energy to kill themselves. That's what medication can do. So
they're running essentially both tracks.
they're switching from one hemisphere to the other. It's active. We
Oh.
all have circles in both hemispheres, right and left. We all, by age 5, We've experienced so many conflict shocks, and I'm talking in those territorial areas, which are the temporal lobe. There's 5 on each side. By age 5, we've probably ignited most of them. Depending on which one is accentuated, it shows us we're either going to be goal oriented, driven, and happy, or inward, down, slower, inward, more depressed. That's what bipolar is switching back and forth between the left and the right hemispheres all the time, every minute. That's bipolar.
Wow. And can we resolve this?
Well, for the territorial ones that we've had for all of our lives, no, we do not want to resolve them. However, you can learn about them and you can make them pretty much go away so that they don't influence your life. And that's about understanding, really learning Germanische Heilkunde on a very deep level, understanding what your particular constellations are and the combinations that we have. We all have combinations. So if we have a certain event that occurs, it triggers this program, which triggers this program, which triggers this program. So now we've got 3 constellations running, plus a couple biological programs. That's super common. That this is what most people are these days.
Most people have 3 constellations
Oh,
running.
I'm not saying 3. We have many. We have many, many, many. And it all depends on how they're grouped. Sometimes you can turn just one on, but oftentimes you're turning on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It all depends on how you're wired.
So you're saying essentially by the age of 5, based on the constellations that we have running and programs we have running from the various even mini traumas we went through and our perception of the events through our life, this essentially sets us up and determines whether or not we're going to be, this is what impacts whether or not we're like introvert or extrovert.
Correct. Yep.
It's not just something like we're just naturally born into.
I suppose there's that as well, but your psyche will take that into, it uses that to interpret the events around you.
Right.
So it's like it's all kind of the same kit and caboodle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. And
It's amazing.
you said if you have a very long-term territorial conflicts active, you don't want to resolve them.
Correct. So we have ones that are there all the time. They're permanent. They never turn off. So think of someone
Oh.
who's a type A personality. They've got one of the manic ones turned on. It's not turning off. And that's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with that. They don't want to turn it off if they've had it on for a long time because it might not be a good healing phase for them, or it may not be. Yeah, I mean, it's territorial, so it doesn't run on a physical level. But if you turn one program off, then it will run on a physical level on the other hemisphere because now you've unconstellated, and that can have fatal implications. So, yeah, we don't think about resolving these. We think about learning what they are, learn what your tracks and triggers are, and then changing your relationship to those, seeing them in a different light, see them in a new perspective. So instead of thinking, oh, my husband hates me because he's yelling, it's a matter of, hey, honey, this doesn't work for me when you use this tone of voice, and then realizing, okay, I'm going to interpret this differently. He's really looking out for our safety, and he's scared, which is why he's raised his voice. Looking at it from a different perspective. I am just making this up. It's going to be different for everyone.
Right.
But generally, right, you don't resolve those. They're not really resolvable, and that's okay. You want to just understand what they are and what your tracks are, right? What's the trigger that starts this program? And then just make peace with that.
So can somebody who's type A, can they decide to not be so type A by through conscious choice?
Well, I would think they could.
Mm-hmm.
But now do they go into that like a type A personality? Now I'm going to do it this way.
Right. So when you're like fighting against this, it's almost like you're working really hard and you're swimming upstream rather than learning how to embrace what's your natural default mode.
That's a great way of putting it. This is our biology. We don't want to fight our biology. That's what we're doing all the time right now as a society. We're fighting our biology. We
Mm-hmm.
don't want to fight our biology. We want to embrace it, understand it, and live according to it.
Right.
I want to point out something else is that we also have non territorial conflicts, non territorial constellations. So look at dementia, right? Dementia is brainstem. It's the brainstem constellation. There's two different ones depending on what the person is displaying as far as symptoms. One's more disorientation, so they're like out of time, out of space. And so when we look at these constellations that are much more basic and primitive, they're not the higher territorial ones we have. And if you know Germanische Heilkunde, then you can unconstellate that forever. You really can. So if you know somebody who's, maybe they've got the brainstem constellation and that's going to be like mental confusion. If they know Germanische Heilkunde and you do, you can get them out of that. And so it doesn't become a permanent state.
Mm.
Same thing with the kidney collecting tubule program, which is the disorientation I mentioned. If you see this happening in someone, you know, okay, they just constellated. They look like they're demented. What just happened? And help them to undo it.
Wait, the kidney collecting tubules is a constellation, not a syndrome?
When you have two, so remember we're
Oh,
talking two in each hemisphere. A single program is not going to do that.
okay.
And it's got
And
to be
this
a
is when
specific
i-
kind. Yeah,
is it two kidney collecting tubule programs or is
correct.
it a kidney collecting tubules plus something else?
Well, if it's kidney collecting tubule and another one in the brainstem, the
Mhm.
other hemisphere has the brainstem constellation, then it's going to be that mental confusion I mentioned. If it's both kidney collecting tubules activated in both hemispheres, then that is the disorientation. If you put both of those together, it's what we call Alzheimer's.
Oh,
Okay. Generally, it's different for everyone. Usually, there's another one or two constellations thrown in there as well.
if Alzheimer's is a result of constellations, how do we have so many like professionals and doctors and people at this point in the belief that if you're that it's and I already know that we're beyond our genetics, but like there's this thought that if it runs in your family that you have the ability to turn it on is
Right. To turn it on. Right. So that's 100 years, 110 years of Rockefeller medicine, right? It's all based on, things that are outside of us. It's genetics, it's malfunctioning bodies, it's all of that stuff. None of that is accurate. But we've all been brainwashed because this is how we've been raised.
right. So it's
Yeah.
so Alzheimer's isn't something that's like inside of you that you can turn on. It's happening as a result of your own constellations. But really, in a sense, I mean, if you're raised in a family, you might have or develop similar perceptions as your mother and father, and then that might cause your psyche to perceive and respond in a similar way as far as like what programs begin to run and then what constellations form, correct?
Correct. Absolutely. If you're raised in a violent household, the chances of you being violent in the household you create are pretty good because that's how you were raised. So
Mhm.
you're going to have similar conflict shocks to your parents, and your kids will as well
Right.
because they're all being raised in a similar environment. That's how we come up with, oh, it's genetics. It's in the family. Same thing with high cholesterol, high blood pressure, heart disease. It's all, you're raised around that environment that kind of is an environment where those conflict shocks are more apt to occur. Doesn't mean they will, but they're more apt to.
Right. Because of our
And,
perception.
right. And same thing with Alzheimer's. Yep.
What is, I'm trying to think of another mental disorder that's kind of one that's always been like from a regular medical perspective hard to understand. What would it
Do you want
be?
to do autism?
Yes.
How's that one? It's a good one.
Okay.
So, again, get back to that. Everything, all the terminology I use has a different definition when we look at it from a Germanische Heilkunde perspective. So, I'm not saying the clinical term that you and I know as autistic. We're going to jump outside that a bit and we're going to broaden that to understand what it is. What is it from a biological perspective? And a lot of people have this. I would say the majority of people have this. It is the combination of two conflict shocks, one in each hemisphere. We already know that it has to be in each hemisphere for it to be a constellation. In this case, it is in the territorial area. On the left-hand side, it's the laryngeal mucosa, which is a scare-fright conflict. On the right-hand side, it is a territorial anger conflict. That's the stomach, the stomach ache I mentioned earlier. The bile ducts, pancreatic ducts, pylorus, duodenobulb, all of that. It's all in one relay on the right-hand side. And that is a territorial anger. So a combination of I'm afraid and I'm angry. That sets you up for a constellation as long as it fits those three criteria that we talked about earlier. And then your quote in the autistic constellation. Now, that could be someone who's just a little bit shy in a certain circumstance. So when I was young, I was very shy in a social setting, such as school, very, very shy at home. Very shy at school. But when I was home, I was not shy at all. So I was autistic at school because I had experienced a very distressing event when I was about 4 years old in school. So that set me up for the rest of, my school age life. So know that the mildest form of this can be a little bit of shyness in a certain circumstance. To the next step up would be more shyness in many areas. To the next step up would be more withdrawn from society because you're so incredibly shy, to eventually being nonverbal and non-communicative at all. Huge, huge spectrum. Most of us are on the lower edge of this. But we've got folks, as we see now in today's day and age, way on the other end of it.
Right.
And again, it's two biological programs that would be a scare fright and a territorial anger.
Well, then how do we explain like when young kids start displaying symptoms and signs of autism?
Same thing. They have experienced these conflict shocks and have this constellation. This can happen in utero. It can happen at birth. It can happen after birth. It can happen as a baby, as a toddler. Again, we do not have the society like we had over 100 years ago that was much more close-knit.
Mm-hmm.
It's different now. And I'm not trying to glorify what we had because there was a lot not good around, societies 100 years ago. But when we look at the work of Dr. Weston A. Price, it ties it all together. So if you're a Weston Pricer, then you're familiar with what what Dr. Price discovered in the 1920s when he went around the world. He lived with native people, eating native diets, living in native societies. Well, it's exactly what Dr. Hammer figured out almost 100 years later is like that's the kind of society we live in, where there is no mental illness, there's no obesity, there's no heart disease, there's no cancer, there's no dementia, there's nothing like that in those societies that Dr. Price discovered in the 1920s that still existed. There's very few of those left now.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because so many people just like automatically assume, I've heard this asked so many times, oh, well, if that were true, referring to like the language of GHK and the understanding of dis-ease, like how do you explain a 7-year-old getting lymphoma, or how do you explain, all these things? But when you're looking at it through this lens, it's like it does make sense, but so many people assume that a 2, a 1, a 2, a 5-year-old aren't capable of having these conflict shocks or feeling this level of emotion. And it's like, well, no, we are still having these experiences, even if we're not of the age that we can, in the use of language, verbalize it.
Right, exactly. This is not mental and it's not emotional. This is biological.
Hmm.
So if you're in your first trimester, let's say you're an embryo in the first trimester and there's a lot of loud noises in the environment, you're still, the size of what, a pinhead, or, maybe a half an inch. You can experience biological conflict shocks that impact you for the rest of your life. That's what we would call Down syndrome right there. We know you can heal Down syndrome.
Whoa, wait, Down syndrome is from
Conflict
what?
shocks.
Which ones?
Hearing. It's hearing, two hearing constellations. Yeah.
Two hearing constellations.
Yep.
And this can be from loud noises?
Loud noises. So jackhammers going off, an explosion, the blender on the counter, which is right at belly height. All of those. Yeah.
Interesting. But now, how do you explain so many things? Like, how do you explain then this idea, or more new age concept, that like Down syndrome and autism and all of this is coming, like if you have say you have a healthy baby, the baby presents no symptoms, and like a lot of people now are associating something like vaccine schedules with Down syndrome or autism. Like, how do you correlate that?
Right. So I am not discounting any of that. There can
Uh-huh.
absolutely be conflict shocks that are experienced at the moment of an injection. And so you have to look at that. And you
Mm-hmm.
also have to look at what's being injected into them, because if it's nerve agents that cross the blood-brain barrier, then they'll be compromised.
Right.
So you have to look at the bigger picture. There's not one size fits all here. You have to look at what has that child experienced.
Right.
And then you have to, you pull all the pieces apart and then you can find, okay, this is what really happened. And it might be the vaccine. It might be the experience they had with the vaccine. It might have been something that was 6 months before. It's going to be different for everyone.
Right. Right. And maybe even just like you said, there could be some other program running, and then you have a conflict shock from the experience of it. And then
Correct.
now you have two conflict shocks possibly running on both hemispheres, creating a constellation.
Correct. Yep.
It's so complex.
It
Okay,
is. It is.
I know I'm kind of feeling it sometimes, and I know people who are listening could be feeling this, like this idea, okay, this is way too complicated. How am I ever going to heal? Like, how am I could have been born with this. This happened in my first trimester. Like, I'm doomed, Like, this is like,
Right.
where's the light?
Yeah. Okay. So let's go there, because whether it's actually fairly easy and simple, but I will say it's most important to learn Germanische Heilkunde and to learn it well. And you're probably thinking, I don't have time to learn it. You do. You really, truly do, especially if your health depends on it and if your mental outlook for the rest of your life depends on it. It's really important to learn it well. Take Take a few weeks, take a few hours, learn it. I have a basic course called Beyond Holistic Medicine where it's less than 4 hours long, but I do a weekly teleconference. So if you can watch the videos, get on the teleconference in 4 weeks, you're going to have what you need to move forward. And if you need more, you've got the course for the rest of your life, and you can be on the teleconferences for the rest of your life. So it's easy. It's easier than you think. And we approach every single conflict shock the same way. So it's not like you have to learn different techniques or modalities or anything. No, not at all. Whether it's a 6-month-old baby, you're going to do the same thing with a 6-month-old baby as what you're going to do with a 50-year-old man. It's all the same thing. You just have to learn the basics first.
What would you do with the 6-month-old baby?
It depends on the program running. So let's say a 6-month-old baby is suddenly paralyzed, can't use his legs. This is a real life example of a child who got stuck in a crib. This is kind of the older cribs where you could get stuck. And the baby was paralyzed, couldn't move his legs anymore. So the parents knew Germanische Heilkunde, and they were able to show the baby that yes, you can indeed move your legs, put him in the crib, moved his legs around where they were stuck, helped him get unstuck. So in his psyche, you're reaching his psyche. You're not looking at it from his mind or emotions. You're reaching his psyche, that inner part of himself. You're connecting that you're stuck. Oh, now you're unstuck. And so this child was fine. This baby could crawl, learned to crawl and was right on schedule. Got functioning back within hours of his psyche interpreting, oh, I'm not stuck anymore. Same thing with a 50-year-old man who suddenly, oh, I'm so weak all of a sudden, I don't know why I can't walk. Same thing. Something just occurred. There's some sort of stuck conflict that this man occurred. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to attach to that psyche. Look, yes, you can move. And you do that any way you can with what that person is presenting with.
Gotcha. Okay, there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely, and it's easier than you think. It just takes a deep dive, though, into yourself from an entirely different perspective. We don't analyze your toilet training. We don't do emotional or mental kinds of counseling. That's not at all what we do. In fact, that can keep you stuck, and I've seen that many times. And I'm not discounting it. It can be very, very helpful for many people for a period of time, and then it's a matter of switching to biology. Switching to the biological programs that are running in your body. Once we do that, and if you can start with that, that's really, really powerful. What are my programs? How am I keeping them active? That's all you have to change your perspective on.
We're learning the language of our body.
Yes, exactly. So here's a good example for you. This is a woman this is in Germany with Dr. Hammer. She had a horrible, distressing time. She was the caretaker of her elderly dad, and she arranged after a number of years to go on a week's vacation. So she had, caregivers for him and the whole bit. She left. Something happened, and the caregivers put him, called the ambulance. We've got to get him in the hospital. They brought him to the hospital. They realized, oh, he's elderly. We don't have much room here. Let's take him to the psych hospital. They put him in a psych hospital. And he was fine. He had no psychological issues. He had no dementia, nothing. He's put in here. He is stunned and shocked beyond measure. The daughter finally gets home and realizes, oh my gosh, what's happened? She goes to see him. He can't speak. He's had so many conflict shocks. He's lost his sense of voice. She then experiences, I think it was 14 biological programs that occurred in this whole incident. Well, her dad died within 6 weeks. You can imagine, more conflict shocks there. She had a CT scan. She went to Dr. Hammer. This is what he read. If you went to him, you had to have a CT. He looked at her CT. Okay, you've got 14 programs running. Then what you need to do is you've got to change your relationship to your dad. It's all about the father. So, how do you do that? Well, she went home. She started talking to her family about her dad. She had a certain, belief system about her dad of who he was, and she knew him quite well. Well, the family had other ideas. Everyone has their own opinion of other people. So she talked through all her family members and she gained a new perspective on her dad. And just by doing that, this took 5 years. 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, all of those programs were finished. Any one of them could have been fatal. I want to point that out. Any one of them was fatal. She resolved it all. That's the work. This is what we do.
Mm. Yeah, and I really like that story because some people might, I'm like 5 years, but that's 5 years. That's a long time. Um, in the grand scheme of things, it's really not, right? Like, not if it meant that it saved you from like severe sickness, severe illness, or death.
Right. So we're brought up to believe in quick fixes.
Uh-huh.
Oh, give me a pill, get rid of symptoms. Give me some homeopathy, get rid of symptoms. Give me this herbs, get rid of symptoms. That's not how our bodies work. And
Right.
because we have that mindset, that's why we're so constellated.
Right.
That's one reason we're so sick. We have to get back to who are we biologically? Because our biology, our psyche, our brain, and our organs are all one unit. If we affect one, we affect all.
Right. Yeah, and this is so important too because we don't want to quit too soon. We don't want to like try something and be like, well, it's not working and then just like default back to something else, and
Right,
it's like that,
right,
like what would have happened had she quit doing this work after 3.5 years,
right. She
you
probably would
know?
have died.
So,
Yeah. So you keep doing what you do until you get to the point where it can never happen again. And you realize that it's all resolved. You've made peace with it. You
mhm,
can't do that mentally per se. You have to do it by taking action. It's concrete, real time action that you take. She picked up the phone, she called all her relatives over the course of all these years. She talked deeply with all of them so that she could have a new understanding of her dad.
mhm,
Notice she did not do this by herself. It took her
right.
whole family helping her. Right now, what do? It's like, oh, just give me a pill or just give me an herb. And we don't have the interpersonal relationships we used to have with our families, with our people, the folks that most supposedly should be supporting us. How many people it's like, oh, Christmas, I've got to be with them again. Right? Right?
Yeah,
This is a sign of a constellated society. We are not living in our biology when you hear things like that.
right. Well, the thing that's so cool too is the more we learn about this, yes, we might, like, for example, I'll just speak for myself. Like, okay, I'm learning about this. I've been kind of totally diving deep into it for the last 6 or 7 months. And I might still have, I know I still have constellations and programs running that could be all the way from like very, very, very early childhood. And I'm working on that slow and steady. But in the meantime, as I gain this awareness, what I'm able to do is also hopefully over time strengthen my ability to understand this biological language of my body and help to ensure that I don't keep creating or getting stuck in new programs as they might present. Like if say in a week I have a situation happen that with work or a relationship that could send me into a biological program, because I'm more aware, I'm going to be able to hopefully resolve that quickly to then go through the healing phase rather than it lingering for a prolonged period of time, therefore creating even a more intense healing phase.
Absolutely. It's all about self empowerment, knowing yourself in a whole new way. When you know
Hmm.
yourself in a different way, you start to move through your life in a different way. That's what we
Right.
all need to be doing. That's why we all need to learn this.
Yeah, I agree. Do you feel from your perspective and just your experience and where you're at and what you understand about this and seeing our society and our culture highly constellated, do you feel hopeful that we can move through this and gain more health and overcome these constellations as a collective in time?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I see pockets of it all over the world. Yes. Yes.
Very
We can
cool.
do this. We can do this right here in our own lives, right here in the United States. We can do it in any developed nation, anywhere.
Mm.
Yes.
And just for clarity for people who are listening, we're not saying through this lens that there's not a place for medicine or herbs or homeopathy. We're just saying that we want to address the resolution of conflicts and also know what the appropriate medicine or alternative medicine is to support the healing phase um, rather than interfere with it.
Correct. Yes. Every modality is valid. All of it has validity for sure. But once you learn Germanische Heilkunde, you have a new understanding of how to use it and when.
Right.
It's different than what we think.
Right.
And when we're able to use it in a new way, we need it a quarter of the time or way less than we thought.
Right. But there, like, even like how you had explained with Dr. Hammer, there is a time and place that maybe because you were in conflict for so long and not being aware of it, that you might need support in the healing phase. Like you might end up needing a surgery or something to help you while also resolving the conflict.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why, for the most part, it all has validity. Now, some parts of allopathic medicine do not have validity, and those are the ones that are going to fall away over the next, few decades. But the ones that are valid that we need, those are never going to go away, and that's fine.
Awesome. If you had one message to share with the world, what would you want to share? If you could only share one message.
One message would be, and I sound like a broken record, but learn the biology of your body, your psyche, your brain, your organs. Because if you do, you will be empowered with information for the rest of your life. You will see the entire world from a different perspective, the whole natural world. You'll realize how we are all connected through nature, through our biology. It's the most empowering thing you can do for yourself and your children, especially. If we can raise our kids to understand, they all understand their biology in a whole new way, then we have just changed the planet in one generation.
So true.
Yeah.
So true.
Yes.
Where can people connect with you to learn more about the programs that you offer?
Good question. Go right to my website. It's andilockemears.com. And all my programs are on there. And if you want a discovery consult, that's a free 20-minute just to discover, what's the best route for you to take. We don't do medical or health advice on that. But if you want to figure out, well, where do I go from here? Sign up for a 20-minute discovery consult and we'll go forward. We'll meet and figure that out together.
Awesome. And you are on
Yes.
Instagram as well.
Instagram, Facebook, yes, LinkedIn even. And I've got a Telegram group for my students. There's all kinds of opportunities out there. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, Andi, thank you so much for joining me. I feel like I could literally pick your brain for I don't know, maybe like the whole year, every hour of it. I feel like I could just keep going and going and going, but out of respect for time, I think this is a good place to end it. But wow, you are absolute wealth of knowledge and wisdom, and I'm really glad that you are continuing to learn this stuff even more deeply and then share it and spread this message. So thank you so much.
You are so welcome. It is definitely my passion, and I'm so glad to be here and to be able to speak to all of your listeners. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, there we have it. How amazing is the human body? We are so complex but brilliant biological beings. I really hope that you found value in today's episode. And if you have found value in this episode or any episode on this podcast, please take a moment to go to the Apple Podcast app and leave a 5-star rating and a quick review. When you do this, it does help me to expand my reach so that more people have the opportunity to learn about empowerment and healing. You could also share your favorite episode with a friend who might need to hear it, or tag me on social media and share your favorite episode there. Your support is always appreciated. Now, have fun exploring all the new routes and paths and directions this week, and until next time, make the week great.